Tonight we are wandering down cobbled streets slick with the dampness of yesterday's rain, where the lanterns flicker and the air smells faintly of wood smoke and roasted chestnuts. It's the Middle Ages, and you're already in trouble. The villagers have caught you whispering too much, wagging your tongue at the wrong time, maybe spreading one juicy bit of gossip too far. Now, instead of a quiet night at home, you're being fitted with a pair of wooden monstrosities, oversized shoes so ridiculous they make clown shoes look like sleek Italian leather. You try to step forward, but the weight drags your feet like anchors. People laugh, children point, and you wonder if your ankles will survive this parade. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this with dignity intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle through the market square, the shoes biting into your skin. They're heavy, crudely carved, more block than shoe. Each step lands with a hollow clomp, echoing against the timbered houses. It's not the kind of sound that inspires fear, it's more like the sound of someone dragging furniture across the floor. And that's the point. Punishment here isn't just about pain, it's about spectacle. Your humiliation feeds the crowd's amusement, reminding everyone what happens when a tongue flaps too freely. In fact, shoes of shame, or Schandkarren as some German records suggest, were often grotesquely oversized, forcing the wearer to wobble. The wider the rumor you spread, the bigger the shoe they strapped to you. Imagine today's equivalent, being forced to walk through town with clown shoes the size of surfboards. Pretty effective deterrent. Mainstream history confirms that medieval justice leaned hard on humiliation as punishment. Stocks, pillories, and public shaming were cheaper than jail cells. And shoes. Everyone noticed shoes. They weren't just practical, they were symbolic. To walk properly meant you had status, to be hobbled meant disgrace. The oversized punishment shoes twisted that symbolism into comedy. One quirky tidbit, some of these shoes had bells attached, so every step jingled like you were leading a parade of your own disgrace. Children would sometimes follow along, chiming in with songs, mocking rhymes, or rude gestures. You became the medieval version of viral entertainment, except instead of TikTok views, you got rotten cabbages. Historians still argue whether these shoes were primarily for gossips or for petty criminals like thieves and swindlers. Some records blur the line, lumping gossip under moral disorder, a vague category that could include anything from skipping church to drinking too much ale on a Wednesday. Either way, the shoes marked you as a fool. The smell of mud mixes with the sharp tang of horse manure as you drag yourself down the high street. A baker leans out his window, flour dust clinging to his eyebrows, and smirks. A passing priest murmurs something about vanity and sin. And you try not to topple sideways, but the shoes seem designed for maximum instability. At one point, you almost do fall, and someone shouts, "Careful! Don't gossip with the cobblestones." The laughter that follows is cruel, but also strangely rehearsed, as if this has happened dozens of times before. Let's pause for a joke. If you ever feel embarrassed about tripping on your shoelaces in public, remember there were entire punishments based on making people trip. Compared to that, you're doing fine. The shoes dig deeper into your ankles, your toes press against the rough wood. Blisters form. You can't walk quickly, so your humiliation stretches on for hours. It's not pain that breaks you, it's time. Every shuffle adds to your shame, and the crowd never tires of the spectacle. Punishment ends not with a whip crack, but with your quiet collapse into exhaustion. There's a lesson here, though medieval towns rarely phrased it kindly. The message was, talk less, work more. Of course, humans being humans, gossip never really stopped. The shoes may have slowed tongues for a week or two, but soon enough, someone else was strapped in. And you, if unlucky, might find yourself back in them next month. The memory lingers as you're finally released. Your feet ache, your pride is shredded, and your ears still ring with mocking laughter. The shoes, scuffed and stained, are carried back to the town hall to wait for the next victim. Somewhere, in the corner, you hear someone whispering, already gossiping about your punishment. The cycle continues. The next time you're caught breaking rules, it isn't your feet that take the punishment, it's your head. Imagine this: you're dragged into the square, your arms held tight by two burly constables who smell faintly of onions and ale. The crowd gathers, buzzing with anticipation. Instead of oversized shoes, someone brings out an iron bucket. Not the light, tinny kind you'd buy at a garden store today. This one is thick, heavy, and dented from years of use. The rim glints with rust, and the handle clanks as it's lifted. Then, with all the ceremony of crowning a king, they slam it down over your head. You suddenly hear the world differently, muted, metallic, like being inside a church bell. The air grows hot and stale inside your new helmet. You try to speak, to argue, to bargain, but your voice bounces back at you, muffled, absurd, and tinny. The townsfolk laugh. You don't sound like yourself anymore. You sound like a frog yelling from inside a cauldron. This punishment wasn't just for laughs, it was meant to humiliate. Petty criminals, debt dodgers, and public nuisances often wore buckets as headgear. In some German towns, they called it the Schandhaube, the hood of shame. In others, it was simply the bucket cap. Whatever the name, the purpose was clear: to make you look ridiculous and remind everyone else what not to do. Mainstream history tells us buckets were a common household object, so everyone recognized the absurdity of wearing one on your head. It turned you into walking slapstick. Children tugged at their mother's sleeves, begging to see the fool with the bucket. For once, crime did pay, just not for you. One quirky tidbit: some accounts describe buckets filled with stones or sand before being placed on the offender's head. That way, the punishment wasn't only humiliating but also neck-straining. Imagine the medieval chiropractor's business booming if chiropractors had existed. As it was, you just ended up sore for days. And here's where historians still argue: was the bucket always metal? Some argue wooden pails were used instead, lighter but just as humiliating. Others think the iron version was reserved for repeat offenders, the medieval version of 3 strikes and you're out. The truth is muddled, much like the echo inside your iron helmet. The sensory details overwhelm you. Every laugh outside becomes a booming drum in your skull. The bucket's rough rim digs into your shoulders. Someone taps on it with a stick, and it rings like a gong. The crowd roars with laughter. You stumble forward blindly, arms stretched out, trying not to collide with the well in the square. But you do, clang, and the noise is so loud it startles the geese tethered nearby, sending them honking in protest. Now even the animals seem to be laughing at you. Let's slip in a joke. If you've ever worn noise-cancelling headphones and accidentally shouted louder than you realized, just imagine doing that in front of your entire town while wearing a rusty bucket. Congratulations, you're officially medieval surround sound. Some records suggest offenders had to wear the bucket for hours, sometimes even paraded through the streets. The echo chamber inside magnified every cough, every grunt, every plea for mercy. Sleep was impossible. Drinking or eating? Forget it. Your dignity had been boiled down to this: a walking, stumbling dinner bell. The bucket's weight starts to crush your neck muscles. Sweat runs down your face, stinging your eyes. You try to shift it, but the constables whack it back into place with a stick. You can't escape. You can only endure. That's the twisted beauty of this punishment. No one needed chains. The bucket chained you in place with shame alone. Eventually, when they finally pry it off, the air feels cool and sweet. The world sounds normal again, though your ears are still ringing. The crowd disperses, chattering about your humiliation, already replaying the funniest moments for those who missed it. And you're left with a sore neck, a bruised forehead, and the knowledge that for weeks, maybe months, you'll be the bucket head to everyone you meet. The bucket, like the shoes of shame before it, goes back into storage, waiting for the next unlucky head to crown. Somewhere, a blacksmith hammers at the rim to make it round again. And life in the town continues, buckets stacked neatly in the corner of justice. Your relief at having the bucket taken off your head doesn't last long. The town has another favorite trick up its sleeve, or rather, under your feet. This time, it isn't about making you sound ridiculous, but about making every single step feel like dragging a prison behind you. You've been selected for the clog walk. The constables drag you to the market square again, because humiliation, apparently, works best in front of an audience, and they bring out a set of shoes that make the wooden monstrosities from earlier look merciful. These are massive clogs, carved out of thick, unpolished wood, and they aren't just oversized. They're chained together. Your left shoe is connected to your right by a short length of iron, so every step feels like you're trying to dance in handcuffs. Spoiler, you're not Fred Astaire. The crowd gathers quickly. Farmers lean on their carts, children perch on barrels, and even the local priest pauses mid-sermon to watch. You're shoved forward, and suddenly you're wobbling, your knees jerking like a poorly wound puppet. The clogs slam into the cobblestones with such force you swear you're cracking the street in half. You shuffle, you stumble, you nearly topple face first into the dirt. The laughter follows like a tide. Mainstream records confirm that such punishment parades were common in medieval towns. They weren't about torture, they were about spectacle. Why lock someone up when you could turn their shame into free public entertainment? It was, in a way, community theatre, just with very unwilling actors. One quirky tidbit: in some towns, offenders were made to walk in clogs filled with pebbles or nails turned upward, adding just enough pain to each step to make it memorable. Not enough to maim, but enough that you cursed your way down the street. Historians still argue whether these harsher versions were widely practiced or just local exaggerations, but the image is hard to shake. Wobbling, clanking, grimacing, all while being mocked by neighbors. The sensory detail hits hard. The chain scrapes, the clogs thud, and the crowd jeers. Someone throws a rotten apple, it splats against your shoulder. A dog barks and runs alongside you, convinced you're part of some bizarre parade. You sweat under the midday sun, your breath ragged as you try to keep pace, though the clogs give you all the grace of a penguin on roller skates. Let's slip in a joke here. If you've ever tried walking while holding a phone, a coffee, and a bag of groceries all at once, that's nothing compared to this. At least you don't have a cheering section waiting for you to trip. The punishment isn't just about the walk. It's about the route. They send you through every busy street, past the church, the tavern, the blacksmith's forge. Everyone has to see you, everyone has to laugh, and everyone has to remember. That way, the lesson sinks in not just for you but for everyone else who might be tempted to bend the rules. At one point, the chain between your clogs catches on a loose stone, and you pitch forward. The crowd gasps, then howls with laughter as you scramble to right yourself. The constables give you no sympathy. They prod you onward with sticks, making sure you complete the full circuit of humiliation. Historians note that punishments like the clog walk blurred the line between law and carnival. Onlookers didn't just observe, they participated. They mocked, they sang, they jeered. In some accounts, musicians followed behind, banging pots or playing rude tunes on flutes. It wasn't punishment in silence, it was punishment in stereo. Finally, when your legs are trembling and your shoulders sag from the effort of balancing, the parade ends. The clogs are unchained and yanked off. Your feet feel strangely light, though raw and blistered. You sink onto a bench, gulping air, while the townsfolk disperse, chuckling to themselves. Someone will retell the story tonight in the tavern, embellishing your stumbles, exaggerating your near falls. You'll live in memory not as a thief, a gossip, or a petty lawbreaker, but as the fool who couldn't even walk properly. The clogs, like the bucket, are carried back to storage. Tools of justice, tools of theatre, waiting for the next unlucky soul to shuffle through their dance of disgrace. You think maybe you've endured the worst. Oversized shoes, iron buckets, chained clogs, you've practically become a medieval slapstick act. But the tavern-goers of your town have their own brand of justice, and tonight, you're the star of the show. Welcome to the punishment known as the drunkard's bucket. It starts in the alehouse, as so many bad ideas do. You've had one too many tankards, your laughter is too loud, and your arm-waving stories knock into other patrons' drinks. Maybe you've started singing bawdy songs off-key, or maybe you're just snoring in the corner when you should be paying your tab. Either way, the tavern keeper has had enough. With a grunt, he signals for his assistants. They drag out a wooden bucket, the kind used for fetching water or dumping swill. It's big, round, and sloshing suspiciously. You don't get time to wonder what's inside before they loop the handle over your head and let the bucket dangle at your chest like an absurd necklace. The punishment is simple. You're forced to wear the bucket until the tavern decides you've learned your lesson. Every step makes the liquid inside, sometimes just water, sometimes ale, sometimes something less pleasant, slosh back and forth, soaking your clothes, splashing your chin, and making you stink like a brewery floor. Mainstream records confirm that public drunkenness was a huge concern in medieval towns. Disorderly drinkers could be fined, whipped, or forced into stocks. But in some places, tavern justice leaned toward humiliation, not injury. Wearing a sloshing bucket made you the evening's entertainment. No one in the alehouse needed a minstrel if they had a drunk staggering around with a swinging bucket. A quirky tidbit: in a few regions, the bucket wasn't worn on your chest, it was strapped around your neck like a collar, with its contents deliberately foul. Tavern lore tells of buckets filled with spoiled ale, dishwater, or even pig slop. Whether that's true or just barroom exaggeration, historians still argue. Was it punishment, or just an excuse for everyone else to laugh harder? The sensory details here are almost too vivid. The bucket bangs against your ribs, bruising you with every sway. The liquid inside slops up over the rim, dripping down your tunic, soaking into your hose, and pooling in your shoes. The smell is sour yeast, sweat, maybe even something worse, and it clings to you like a curse. Patrons raise their mugs and cheer each time you stumble, as if you're part of some tavern floor circus. Let's drop a joke here. If you've ever spilled your drink all over yourself at a party, imagine wearing the entire keg as a bib. Congratulations, you're the entertainment. The tavern doesn't let you sit down, of course. That would defeat the point. You're pushed into dancing, staggering, sometimes even mock-served by the barmaids, who pretend to ladle soup from your bucket as the crowd roars. Your humiliation isn't just punishment, it's comedy. You're the punchline everyone's been waiting for. Hours pass this way, or maybe it just feels like hours. Eventually, when you're drenched, sticky, and smelling like a swampy brewery, they unhook the bucket and toss you outside. The night air bites at your wet clothes, and the stars spin overhead. You slump against the tavern wall, trying to wring out your tunic, while laughter still echoes from inside. Tomorrow, when you wake up sore and reeking, the memory of your bucket debut will stick with you along with the reputation. Everyone will remember the night you sloshed your way into shame. The drunkard's bucket wasn't universal, but it left its mark in tavern folklore. It shows us something odd. Medieval punishments weren't always about severity. Sometimes, they were about creativity. Sometimes, they were about laughter at someone else's expense. And sometimes, as you sit there dripping, you realize medieval justice cared less about reform and more about the spectacle. The bucket, emptied and rinsed, goes back behind the bar. Tomorrow, it might hold water again. Or slops. or someone else's pride. Tonight, it's been your burden. Just when you think you've earned the right to stay far away from buckets and wooden footwear, the constables come up with a new twist. This time, you're not made to wear anything, you're made to stay put. You're marched out to the pillory, that heavy wooden frame where townsfolk lock people by the neck and wrists. But here's the innovation: your shoes are nailed in place. The pillory itself is intimidating. Two thick beams of oak clamp around your neck and hands, holding you in a forward-bent posture, the wood rough and splintering against your skin. You'd think that's humiliating enough, but no, someone comes forward with a hammer and nails. They crouch down at your feet, place your leather shoes against the platform, and with a few loud thunks, secure them to the boards. You try to wiggle your toes, but there's no escape. You're literally stuck in your shoes. That might not sound like much until hours pass, the sun beats down, and you realize you can't shift your weight to relieve the ache in your calves. It's like being locked into a single awkward yoga pose, except no instructor is coming around to gently correct your form. Mainstream history confirms the pillory was one of the most common public punishments in medieval Europe. People were confined for hours, sometimes days, while the public jeered, mocked, and threw food or worse. But the shoe nailing? That's the quirky twist. It wasn't everywhere, but in some towns, officials deliberately immobilized the feet to prevent fidgeting. After all, humiliation works best when the subject can't wriggle out of it. A curious tidbit comes from reports of offenders trying to slip out of their shoes to gain a little comfort. The answer from the authorities was simple: nail the shoes down. Some chronicles even mention officials deliberately using oversized, borrowed shoes so the humiliation doubled ugly footwear and no escape. Historians still argue whether this practice was widespread or just a local improvisation, but the imagery stuck. The sensory experience is miserable. The pillory forces your back into an ache. Your arms tingle from being stretched forward. And your feet, they throb with the dull agony of immobility. Sweat trickles down your temples, flies buzz near your nose, and there's nothing you can do about it. People wander by, pointing, laughing, making rude comments. Some toss vegetables. Others simply spit. And you're a statue of ridicule, nailed firmly into place. Here's a little modern comparison joke. If you've ever sat through a 3-hour meeting without moving, legs falling asleep, wishing you could stand up, that's child's play compared to this. At least your shoes weren't literally nailed down by Steve from accounting. The punishment drags on, each moment stretched by discomfort and shame. You think about your shoes, the very things meant to carry you through life, now turned into anchors of humiliation. You think about how tomorrow, you'll never be able to wear them again without remembering this day. Maybe that's the point. Every step afterward is a reminder. Some towns turned this into a festive affair. Children might decorate your nailed-down shoes with chalk drawings. Neighbors might hang scraps of cloth from the nailed leather, turning you into an unwilling scarecrow. If someone was feeling particularly creative, they'd slip pebbles or thorns inside, ensuring extra misery. It wasn't torture by medieval standards, it was entertainment. Finally, after endless hours, the officials return. They pry out the nails, yank your feet free, and release you from the pillory. You stumble away, stiff and aching, your shoes scuffed and ruined. Maybe you toss them aside immediately. Maybe you keep them as a grim souvenir. Either way, you'll never look at a hammer and nails the same way again. The pillory creaks as it closes again, standing ready for the next unlucky citizen. And those nails? They'll be used again, still warm with the memory of your humiliation. The shoes nailed to the pillory may have left your pride in splinters, but now comes a punishment that feels more symbolic than physical, though no less humiliating. The constables decide you've been quarrelsome, loud, perhaps too sharp-tongued with your spouse or neighbors. The sentence: You're saddled with the bucket of ashes. It begins at dawn, when the town bell rings and the square fills with murmurs. You're brought forward, not to stocks or pillory this time, but to the center of the marketplace. A wooden bucket appears, ordinary enough at first glance. But when you peer inside, you see it's filled to the brim with grey, powdery ash, the leftover remains of a night's fire. The constables lift it carefully, then strap it across your back with ropes so that the weight presses into your shoulders. You stagger under the burden, coughing as some of the ash swirls into the air. It coats your tunic in a fine layer of dust, clings to your hair, even works its way up your nose until you can practically taste yesterday's hearth. Mainstream history confirms that quarrelsome wives and husbands alike were often punished through humiliation rather than physical harm. The goal wasn't to injure but to mark you as a nuisance, someone who disturbed the peace of the household and, by extension, the town. Carrying a bucket of ashes turned that abstract fault into something visible. You wore your domestic strife for all to see. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some records suggest offenders had to walk a set route through the town, the ash bucket bouncing with every step. If you spilled too much, another bucket was added. Imagine the absurdity of staggering under multiple loads, looking like a soot-covered pack mule, all because you argued too loudly about who forgot to feed the chickens. Historians still argue whether this practice was widespread punishment or more of a folkloric tradition. Some think it was confined to rural villages, where fire ashes were plentiful and symbolic of cooling tempers. Others suggest it was part of larger rituals tied to marriage discipline. Either way, the bucket of ashes remains one of those strange, almost theatrical punishments that blur the line between law and ritual. The sensory reality is suffocating. Ashes aren't heavy like stones, but the bucket digs into your shoulders and the dust never lets you forget it's there. With each step, a puff of grey rises, settling onto your skin, creeping into your eyes. Children laugh and point, adults shake their heads, muttering about the dangers of a sharp tongue or restless temper. Someone jokes that you look like you've just crawled out of a chimney. Another person waves their hand in front of their nose, pretending to choke on your trail of dust. Time drags. You shuffle through the market, past the butchers and bakers, ash staining the air behind you like a ghostly tail. You catch your reflection briefly in the glass of a shop window, a weary figure, shoulders hunched, face streaked with soot. You hardly look human anymore, you look like a smudged drawing of yourself. Here's a light joke for modern ears. If you've ever cleaned out a fireplace and managed to dump the ashes all over the carpet, congratulations, you've already simulated about 30% of this punishment, minus the crowd of villagers laughing at you. The symbolism is the cruelest part. Ashes represent what's left when something burns out, warmth turned to dust, fuel turned to nothing. Carrying them on your back is a reminder that your temper, your quarrels, your harsh words can burn a household down until only ashes remain. You don't need the constables to lecture you. The bucket itself does the talking. Finally, after the long parade, the ropes are loosened. The bucket is lifted away, leaving a fine coating of dust on your clothes and skin. You cough, your throat raw, and wipe your eyes, but the grey streaks stay. The ashes cling to you long after the punishment ends, making sure you carry the memory well beyond today. The bucket is set aside, waiting for the next quarrelsome voice in town. The lesson is simple, if uncomfortable. Words can burn as fiercely as fire and leave just as much ash behind. The ashes have barely settled from your last ordeal before you stumble into another kind of trouble, this one sparked not by your temper, but by your sense of fashion. Picture this. You stride into church wearing a pair of sleek, elongated shoes, the kind with tips so long they curl upward like a question mark. People gasp, some laugh, and a priest scowls as though your footwear alone might drag the congregation straight to hell. You've just violated the pointed shoe ban. These shoes, called poulaines or cracos, were all the rage in the 14th and 15th centuries. The longer the tip, the higher your supposed status. Some were stuffed with moss or horsehair to keep their shape, others tied to the wearer's knees with chains so they didn't flop around too much. Fashion may be pain, but in this case, it also became crime. City councils across Europe issued laws against extravagantly long shoes, calling them sinful, impractical, and a danger to public morals. Mainstream history tells us that King Edward IV of England, in 1463, limited shoe tips to 2 inches for commoners, while nobles could get away with longer ones. France, Poland, and parts of Germany issued similar bans. It was less about tripping hazards and more about controlling social order. Long shoes said, "I have money and leisure," which upset both church authorities and jealous neighbors. One quirky tidbit: some punishments for defying the shoe laws involved cutting off the offending tips in public. Imagine striding proudly into town with curled-up footwear, only for officials to slice them clean off, leaving you with ugly, squared stumps. Some chronicles even describe offenders forced to wear exaggerated wooden versions, so long they had to be carried by attendants, turning the fashion statement into a farce. Historians still argue whether these punishments were consistently enforced or mostly symbolic, laws on the books but rarely applied. Some believe the bans were just moral posturing, while others insist the public mockery was quite real. After all, nothing makes a law memorable like watching someone trip over 2-foot-long fake shoe tips in front of the market crowd. The sensory details stick with you. You imagine the snip of shears as the pointed ends are sliced away, the laughter of onlookers as your proud fashion crumbles into stubs. You picture being marched through the streets in wooden parodies so long they clatter against stones with every awkward step. Pride is heavy, but wooden shoes are heavier. Here's a modern joke to lighten it: if you've ever been told your sneakers are too flashy or your heels too high, at least no one threatened to nail clown extensions on your feet as punishment. Medieval fashion policing took things to a whole new level. The humiliation doesn't end with your shoes. Rumors spread quickly. Did you hear? He thought he was nobility, strutting around in poulaines. By evening, tavern patrons are reenacting your strut, curling their fingers into mock shoe tips and waddling like ducks. You've gone from stylish trendsetter to village punchline in less than a day. The deeper meaning isn't lost on you, though. Shoes are more than leather and laces, they're symbols of status, identity, even morality. To walk in forbidden footwear was to step outside your station, and medieval society punished that not just with fines, but with shame. As you finally tug off the mutilated shoes and toss them aside, you realize fashion can be fleeting, but humiliation has staying power. The wooden parodies are hauled back to storage, waiting for the next ambitious soul who lets their toes get ahead of their station. You've barely recovered from the humiliation of having your fashionable poulaines mocked and snipped when another kind of punishment looms, one that has less to do with style and more to do with stench. Picture yourself hauled once again into the public square, only this time, no oversized clogs or silly wooden contraptions await. Instead, the constables lug out a bucket. Not just any bucket, but one filled to the brim with foul, unmentionable waste. Welcome to the dung buckets of dishonest. The sentence is announced loudly so that everyone hears. For your petty crime, maybe cheating on weights in the market, or shouting insults at your neighbors, you're to wear or endure the bucket. They hoist it up, tip it carefully, and before you can protest, the contents slosh over you. The smell is instant, overwhelming, sour and earthy all at once. You gag, the crowd howls with laughter, and someone pinches their nose dramatically, pretending to faint. Mainstream history confirms that punishments by filth were common across Europe. People caught committing public nuisances were sometimes dunked in rivers, smeared with mud, or doused in buckets of garbage. The idea was simple: dirtiness equals dishonest. You become the living embodiment of the mess you've caused. One quirky tidbit: some records tell of offenders forced to actually carry the bucket on their heads, the slop dripping down their hair and clothes with every step. In other cases, the bucket was tied around the neck, its contents sloshing ominously as you stumbled along. Imagine trying to balance your dignity while essentially becoming a walking compost heap. Historians still argue whether dung itself was always used, or if it was sometimes symbolic ashes, spoiled food, or foul-smelling herbs might have stood in. Either way, the association with filth was what mattered. To the medieval crowd, smelling bad was as humiliating as wearing a bucket hat 3 sizes too small. The sensory detail is relentless. The stench clings to your nostrils until it feels like your very soul smells bad. Flies swarm instantly, buzzing in your ears, landing on your face. The liquid seeps into your tunic, dripping down your legs into your shoes. Each step squelches with wetness, and the laughter of the crowd only grows sharper the worse you look. Here's a modern comparison joke. If you've ever had milk go bad in your fridge and then spilled it on yourself, multiply that by about 100, add flies, subtract dignity, and you've got yourself a medieval Saturday afternoon. The punishment isn't over quickly. You're paraded through the market, forced to carry or wear the bucket for all to see. Children skip behind you, chanting rhymes, while adults wrinkle their noses and cover their mouths in mock disgust. The humiliation isn't private, it's shared, amplified, turned into a communal event. That's the point. Eventually, the parade ends. The bucket is yanked away, though the smell doesn't leave. You're given no water, no soap, no chance to clean up. You're expected to walk home reeking, a living warning against bad behavior. And for days afterward, people will smell you before they see you, snickering as they step aside. The dung bucket, once emptied, is rinsed and stored away, waiting for the next unlucky soul. In the end, it's less a tool of torture than a tool of laughter at your expense. And as you slump away, dripping and stinking, you realize that sometimes the cruelest punishment isn't pain or confinement, it's being turned into the town joke. By now, you've been tripped, bucketed, nailed, and thoroughly humiliated in front of every man, woman, child, and stray goat in the town. But there's a special circle of punishment reserved not for criminals at large, but for a very particular profession, shoemakers. Welcome to shoemakers' justice. Shoemaking was a proud trade in medieval Europe, organized into guilds that regulated everything from pricing to apprenticeships. A guild wasn't just a union, it was a family, a fraternity, and sometimes a jury. If you botched a pair of boots, overcharged a customer, or skipped your guild duties, you didn't just get a scolding, you got punished. And often, those punishments had a shoe-shaped twist. Mainstream history records that guilds could fine or expel members, but humiliation was also part of the toolkit. One punishment involved forcing an apprentice who ruined his work to parade around with the faulty shoes hung around his neck like a clumsy necklace. Imagine staggering through town wearing a lopsided boot dangling against your chest, every onlooker smirking, every fellow craftsman shaking his head in disappointment. A quirky tidbit: some guilds reportedly made lazy apprentices walk in shoes deliberately mismatched in size, one giant, one tiny, forcing them to limp painfully as the crowd laughed. Other tales tell of cobblers made to sit in market squares pounding leather with wooden mallets, not to make shoes, but to make noise, signaling their incompetence to the whole community. Historians still argue whether these stories are literal or exaggerated satire passed down through time. Were shoemakers truly that cruel to their own, or are these legends stitched together like patchwork? The sensory detail is easy to imagine. The shame of a misshapen shoe rubbing against your chest with each step. The ache in your toes as one foot clomps in an oversized clog while the other pinches inside something fit for a child. The sound of wooden mallets pounding rhythmically, not crafting but mocking, a percussion of humiliation echoing through the square. Here's a modern joke for perspective. If you've ever worn 2 slightly different socks to work and spent the whole day feeling self-conscious, imagine that, but on purpose, with your boss clapping sarcastically behind you and the whole neighborhood filming on their phones. Shoemaker's justice wasn't just about individual shame. It reinforced the guild's reputation. A sloppy craftsman didn't just embarrass himself, he embarrassed everyone. By punishing mistakes in public, the guild reminded customers that quality mattered, that shoemaking was an art, and that anyone cutting corners would pay for it in both pride and souls. And of course, the symbolism of shoes ran deep. Shoes carried you through life, through fields, through markets, through ceremonies. To mess them up wasn't just poor workmanship, it was a failure of duty. Punishments turned that failure into comedy, but also into a lesson carved into memory. Finally, when your round of humiliation ends, the guild elders decide whether you're worth keeping. Sometimes, you're forgiven, given another chance at the workbench. Other times, your botched shoes are nailed above the guild hall as a warning to future apprentices, don't be like him. Either way, the punishment lingers long after the shoes have worn out. The tools are packed away, the mallets fall silent, and the town returns to its business. But somewhere, deep in a shoemaker's workshop, an apprentice ties his thread with shaking hands, determined never to stitch his shame into leather again. You're still sore from hobbling in mismatched shoes when the next ordeal creeps up on you, this one less about fashion crimes and more about fighting. Picture the village green on a Sunday afternoon, chickens pecking, dogs barking, neighbors gossiping. Then two men start to argue. Voices rise, shoves are exchanged, and before long someone shouts, "Fetch the bucket." Welcome to the bucket fights, an officially ridiculous but strangely popular medieval punishment for petty brawlers. Rather than lock you up or fine you, the authorities force you and your opponent to strap wooden buckets over your heads. You're each armed with nothing more than your fists, or sometimes padded sticks, and then pushed into a ring. The crowd forms instantly, eager to watch. Mainstream history tells us that variations of this existed in several towns across Central Europe, especially in German-speaking regions. The logic was clear: fighting without weapons, blind and half-deaf inside a bucket, made the punishment both safer and more humiliating. Instead of noble combat, it looked like two clumsy puppets blundering into each other, staggering around while the audience laughed. One quirky tidbit: some towns reportedly filled the buckets with bells, stones, or even soot before strapping them on. So not only were you stumbling blind, but every movement jingled, rattled, or left you sneezing black clouds. Imagine the soundtrack, two bucket-headed fighters colliding while sounding like cheap tambourines. Historians still argue whether these fights were purely punitive or sometimes became a form of sanctioned entertainment. Were they designed to reform rowdy drunks, or simply to give the villagers a free afternoon of slapstick theater? Records are too thin to say for sure, but the tone of the descriptions suggests more comedy than cruelty. The sensory experience is unforgettable. The bucket is heavy on your head, pressing into your shoulders. Inside, your breath bounces back at you, hot and damp. Sound is muffled, reduced to echoes of laughter and your own heartbeat thudding in your ears. Then, wham, you collide with your opponent, wood clanging against wood, both of you stumbling backward like drunken marionettes. Here's a modern joke to keep it light. It's basically the medieval version of two kids fighting in oversized VR headsets, swinging wildly at air while the whole family films it for later laughs. The fight rarely lasts long. Exhaustion sets in quickly inside the bucket, your neck aching, your lungs working overtime. At some point, one of you topples into the dirt, legs kicking helplessly, while the other stands wobbling until the bucket is yanked off. The winner is cheered, though both of you leave humiliated, necks stiff, hair sweaty, faces smudged with soot or dust. The real victory belongs to the crowd. They've been entertained, reminded of law and order, and reassured that violence won't be tolerated unless, of course, it's in the form of two bucket-headed fools colliding for their amusement. When you finally stagger away, the bucket still ringing faintly in your ears, you realize this punishment was never about justice. It was about spectacle, about turning conflict into comedy, about making sure that the next time tempers flared in the tavern, you'd think twice, because who wants to be remembered as the guy who lost a bucket fight? By now you've endured buckets on your head, buckets on your shoulders, buckets full of dung, and you're starting to suspect medieval Europe had a bit of a bucket obsession. And you'd be right. Tonight's punishment is not about fighting or filth but about fear itself, the well bucket dunking. It starts with a simple setup. You're hauled to the village square, where a stone well sits at the center. Children fetch water here daily, women gossip as they draw their pails. Today, though, the well is not for refreshment but for discipline. 2 constables tie a stout rope around your waist, fasten you to a wooden bucket, and crank the handle until you dangle awkwardly above the cold, dark water. Mainstream history describes this punishment as especially common for petty thieves or slanderers. The dunking wasn't about drowning you, it was about scaring you. Into the water you'd go, splashing and sputtering, before being hauled back up for the crowd to jeer at. Sometimes you'd be lowered 3 times, for the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, as if holiness were somehow strengthened by public humiliation. A quirky tidbit: some places didn't stop with wells. Misbehaving bakers or gossiping women might be strapped to larger barrels and dunked into rivers or ponds instead. Records even mention ducking stools, wooden seats fixed to long beams that plunged offenders into water again and again. It was punishment with a rhythm: splash, gasp, laugh, repeat. Historians still argue whether the practice was mainly punitive or more of a carnival spectacle. Some insist it was intended as a serious deterrent, while others see it as medieval slapstick, a watery show for bored townsfolk. The truth, as always, probably lies somewhere between. The sensory details are harsh. The bucket creaks as you sway over the well, rope fibers rubbing against your arms. Then, suddenly, you drop. Cold water closes over your head like a fist. Darkness swallows you. You flail inside the bucket, your feet kicking against slippery stone. Your lungs burn, your ears ring. Just as panic takes hold, you're yanked upward, sputtering, coughing, spitting water in a graceful arc that lands right on a cheering spectator. The laughter redoubles. Here's a modern joke for comparison. It's basically the medieval version of someone shoving you into a dunk tank at a county fair, except the water hasn't been changed since, well, ever. The fear lingers long after the water has dripped away. Your clothes cling to your skin, heavy and freezing. Your teeth chatter. The rope digs into your waist where it held you. And in the crowd, people whisper not about your crime, but about your graceless flailing in the water. The point has been made: you've been washed, in public, but not in honor. The bucket is hauled aside, dripping, waiting for the next poor soul. You stumble away, shivering, hair plastered to your forehead, wondering if you'll ever drink from that well again without tasting humiliation in the water. Your clothes are still damp from the well dunking when yet another punishment awaits, one that isn't quite as wet, but just as absurd. This time, the village constables drag out a collection of wooden clogs, sandals, and leather boots, all of them mismatched, oversized, or oddly shaped. You already sense where this is going: the dreaded shoe parade of shame. The punishment is simple in design but devastating in effect. Instead of locking you up or beating you, the authorities force you to walk through town in humiliating footwear. Some shoes are built with heels so high they pitch you forward, others have soles so uneven you totter like a newborn calf. Sometimes they give you a pair with one shoe several sizes too big, the other far too small, so every step is a lurching comedy. Mainstream history gives us glimpses of this in accounts from Northern Europe, where local courts loved to blur the line between discipline and spectacle. Petty criminals, especially those guilty of gossip, drunkenness, or marital squabbles, were sometimes marched in deliberately awkward outfits. Shoes became the perfect prop, visible, ridiculous, and symbolic of walking the wrong path. One quirky tidbit: there are tales of wooden shoes filled with pebbles, forcing the offender to hobble painfully through town while trying to keep a straight face. Another describes sandals nailed to wooden boards, turning each step into a loud clack that drew attention from every corner. The noise itself was part of the punishment. You couldn't hide your shame when your very feet announced it with every stride. Historians still argue whether these shoe parades were localized traditions or widespread practices. Some say the stories may have grown from carnival customs, where people dressed in exaggerated costumes for fun. Others argue that real offenders were indeed subjected to this clownish footwear, precisely because laughter was a more powerful weapon than fear. The sensory imagery is vivid. Imagine stumbling forward, one shoe flopping loose, the other crushing your toes. The crowd lines the streets, pointing, laughing, some even mimicking your uneven gait. Children follow behind, exaggerating your limp, clapping along with the clacking sound of your nailed soles. The hot cobblestones sting through the thin leather, the oversized boot slaps your shin with every swing. You try to keep your balance, but dignity is harder to hold onto than any pair of laces. Here's a modern joke for perspective: if you've ever tripped in flip-flops at the grocery store and pretended it didn't happen, imagine doing that non-stop for an hour while an entire village cheers for your clumsiness. The parade doesn't end until you've been marched around the square, past the church, and back to the courthouse steps. By then your feet ache, your pride is blistered, and the laughter still rings in your ears. The shoes are yanked off, tossed aside for the next offender, and you're left barefoot in the dust, your only souvenir the ache in your arches. The symbolism is clear: you walked the wrong path in life, so now you've been forced to literally walk a ridiculous one. And as the crowd disperses, you know the image of your stumbling figure will be retold at taverns for weeks, every step another punchline. Your arches are still throbbing from that ridiculous shoe parade when the bailiffs come up with something even stranger. This time, the punishment doesn't involve walking, but standing. Long, long hours of standing. Welcome to the shoe stocks. At first glance, they look like ordinary pillories, two planks of wood hinged together, with holes cut for ankles instead of wrists. You're forced to slip off your shoes, step inside, and then the boards are clamped shut around your feet. Suddenly, you're trapped, stuck upright in the middle of the market square, your toes wiggling helplessly in the open air. Mainstream history notes that stocks were among the most common punishments across medieval Europe, used for drunks, cheats, or troublemakers. But when tailored to involve shoes, or the lack thereof, the humiliation gained an extra sting. Standing barefoot on cold stone or wet mud for hours was no small discomfort, especially when curious townsfolk strolled by. Some would tickle your exposed soles with straws, others splash water or toss pebbles. One quirky tidbit: some towns required offenders to wear their own shoes backwards while locked in the stocks, a symbolic gesture of walking against order. Others nailed worn-out boots above the frame as a sort of billboard, announcing the offender's folly. Imagine standing there while your scuffed boots dangle mockingly over your head like a crooked halo. Historians still argue whether this was cruelty or comedy. Were the shoe stocks intended to physically punish, with cold and cramp gnawing at your legs? Or were they mostly about entertainment, giving the public a chance to laugh at your immobilized toes? The answer seems to depend on whose town records you read. The sensory experience is miserable. Your calves ache almost immediately from standing still. The planks dig into your ankles, leaving them raw. The ground below is uneven, sharp little stones pressing into your soles. Sun beats down, flies gather, and your legs tremble as hours stretch into eternity. Worst of all is the public interaction. A neighbor saunters past, smirking, and casually pours ale near your feet, not enough to drink, just enough to make your toes sticky. Children dart up to poke you, then giggle as you flinch. Here's a modern comparison. It's like when your phone dies on a crowded train and you're forced to stand there awkwardly with nothing to do, but instead of silent strangers, it's your entire town taking turns making jokes about your bare feet. Eventually, your release comes. The boards creak open, your legs nearly buckle, and your ankles feel bruised from the pressure. You shuffle away, shoes back on, but the phantom ache of standing still clings to you. And worse, the humiliation follows. 4 days afterward, people nudge each other when you walk past. There goes the one who couldn't even stand properly. The stocks are closed again, waiting for the next unlucky offender. Wooden boards may look simple, but they carry the weight of shame heavier than any chain. You'd think after the shoe stocks you'd be safe, surely there couldn't be more footwear-based humiliation left in the medieval arsenal. But then, just as you're limping away from the square, a bailiff waves you down with a grin. Out comes a pair of iron shoes, heavy and clunky, forged not for walking but for punishment. Welcome to the iron shoe torment. They're not elegant like poulaines or silly like mismatched clogs. These are brutal, solid metal, cold to the touch, weighing several pounds each. The blacksmith fastens them onto your feet with a hammer and pins, and suddenly every step feels like dragging anchors. You shuffle forward, sparks of pain shooting up your legs as the metal claps against stone. Mainstream history does record similar devices, iron boots and Spanish boots, though those were often torture instruments designed to crush legs. But in some towns, lighter iron shoes served more as humiliating restraints, forcing the offender to stagger around visibly burdened. The punishment said, "Your crime makes you heavy with shame, so now your feet will carry that weight." One quirky tidbit: some accounts describe offenders being forced to march in processions wearing these shoes while carrying buckets of sand or stones. The symbolism was clear: you're weighed down by sin, trudging along like a beast of burden while the crowd laughs. Others mention shoes deliberately heated before being strapped on, not glowing red hot, but warm enough to burn blisters if worn too long. Historians still argue whether this heating detail is truth or later exaggeration, perhaps mixed up with tales of torture chambers. The sensory detail is vivid. The iron bites at your ankles, cold at first, then hot as friction builds. The weight drags with every step, your breath coming heavier as the shoes clank against the ground. Sparks don't fly literally, but it feels like they do in your bones. Every stumble draws laughter from the crowd. Children mimic your awkward gait, stomping like little knights in imaginary armor. Here's a modern joke: if you've ever worn steel-toe work boots on a hot day and thought, "Wow, these are heavy," just imagine them multiplied by 10, with the added benefit of zero cushioning and 100% humiliation. The walk seems endless. Every corner of the market feels a mile away. You long to kick the iron off, but they're locked tight, reminding you with every clang that you're stuck in this dance of disgrace. Finally, after enough stumbling, the blacksmith reappears, kneels, and hammers the pins loose. The shoes fall away with a thud that echoes in your bones. Your feet feel impossibly light, though raw and sore, as if the ground itself has turned against you. The iron shoes are hauled back to their rack, resting until the next poor fool offends the town. And as you limp away, you know the weight may be gone, but the memory of dragging shame through cobblestones will cling to you long after the bruises fade. You think the iron shoes were the end, the final absurdity in a parade of buckets, clogs, and humiliations. But no, there's one more trick up the medieval sleeve, and it's perhaps the most theatrical of all. Tonight, the constables bring out not a pair of shoes, but a giant wooden bucket, one large enough to climb into. And you're not just carrying it, you're wearing it. They slide the enormous bucket over your shoulders so it encases your body like a cylindrical prison. Only your head and legs stick out, leaving you waddling awkwardly, arms pinned. The crowd erupts into laughter before you even take a step. This is the walking bucket cage, the final absurd punishment on your list of indignities. Mainstream history confirms that barrel punishments were used across Europe, especially for drunkards and gluttons. Offenders were made to wear empty casks, paraded around town as living jokes. The bucket variant followed the same logic. Too much indulgence, too much misbehavior? Then let's make you look like the very container you overfilled. One quirky tidbit: some records say these buckets were painted with crude drawings, pig snouts, donkey ears, turning the offender into a walking caricature. Others added bells or scraps of metal to rattle as you waddled. Imagine your humiliation amplified with every clang. Historians still argue whether this punishment was mostly symbolic theater, more carnival than cruelty, or if it carried real weight. A wooden bucket could be heavy, restricting, even dangerous if you tripped. But the spectacle was what mattered most, the community gathering to laugh at a grown adult turned into a walking barrel. The sensory experience is pure ridiculousness. The bucket is rough inside, the wood scraping your arms. It smells faintly of ale or sour wine, reminders of its original use. Each step makes the bucket shift and bump against your ribs. You sway side to side like an overstuffed doll, your knees knocking into the wood. Every stumble sets the bells jingling and the crowd roaring. Here's a modern comparison. It's like being forced to walk home after a wild party wearing the trash can you just fell into, except everyone's invited to watch. The parade continues around the square, past the church, past the tavern, the laughter following you like a drumbeat. Children point, merchants shake their heads, and somewhere in the crowd, you swear someone sketches you for later gossip. By the time the bucket is lifted off, your hair is plastered with sweat, your dignity long since soaked away. The punishment ends not with pain, but with exhaustion. You stand there, free but ridiculous, the smell of stale ale clinging to your clothes. The bucket is propped against the wall, ready for the next fool. And as you shuffle away, you realize the bucket wasn't just punishment, it was theater, a way of turning human weakness into public comedy. And now, at long last, your journey through peculiar medieval punishments involving shoes and buckets has reached its end. The noise of the crowd fades, and so does the sting of humiliation. The shoes are set back on their racks, the buckets return to their corners, the square emptying until only the faint echo of laughter remains. You are left standing in the quiet evening, the cobblestones cooling beneath your feet, the air softer now that the sun has dipped behind the rooftops. The punishments you endured, heavy shoes, clattering clogs, smelly buckets, awkward cages, were all designed to weigh you down, to remind you of your faults in the loudest, silliest ways. But here, in the calm after, they feel distant. Their edges blur, like old stories told more for amusement than for warning. Your steps grow slower, lighter. The ache in your arches dulls. The stink of the dung bucket, though still faint, no longer makes you gag, it's just another layer of the day fading into memory. And with each breath, the square around you feels less like a place of mockery and more like a quiet stage, where the play has ended and the audience gone home. Historians may argue forever about how often these punishments truly happened, or how much they were exaggerated over time. But to you, their stories now odd, funny, a little cruel, yet somehow more ridiculous than terrifying. They drift away, leaving only the thought that even shame, once endured, becomes lighter in the telling. So you settle yourself at last, no clogs, no buckets, no laughter pressing down. Just the gentle hum of the night, the cooling air brushing over your skin, the kind of stillness that invites your eyelids to grow heavy. And as you let go, remember, the punishments are over, the shoes unlaced, the buckets empty. You're safe, and it's time to rest.